Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. In our recent episodes, we've been detailing how our county government evolved, beginning with the coming of Andrew Jackson in 1821, the establishment of a county commission, whose primary responsibilities for many, many years were establishing and maintaining roads, bridges, and ferries. And this basically continued well into the end of the 19th century. But by that time, we began to have what we might call today compassionate services, which began, of course, with the poor farm in the 1870s and began to move a little bit more in that direction as the end of the last century proceeded. Much of the early 20th century was basically the same. But by the time we pass World War II, the county itself is beginning to change a lot, because now it is growing. Population is growing, and as the population grows, this means the coming of subdivisions. And as subdivisions came, lots of changes came to the work of the county commission. Because as a subdivision was put in place, it required more roads. And basically, while the county itself was not in the sanitation and water business per se, each of these subdivision developers had to provide that kind of service. And each time that happened, there was an involvement some way of the county itself. Now, as we moved into the early part of the 1960s, the county also had a major change facing it in terms of health care. In the 1930s and 40s, we had seen here the coming of the tuberculosis sanitarium and then the beginnings of Escambia General Hospital. By the late 1950s, that hospital and older buildings on the west side was beginning to deteriorate badly. And so a referendum was held, the voters approved it, and a new Escambia General Hospital was erected on West Leonard Street. This was, and we'll kind of compress that story here just a little bit. The idea of another public hospital seemed most popular at the time, but by pure chance, into the mid-60s and then a little bit beyond that, we began to see, first of all, the evolution of Medicare and Medicaid, and this was accompanied by a tremendous technological revolution for equipment that was put in hospitals all across the country. This equipment was very expensive, and so basically the cost of operating a hospital became very high for the county, and by the time we reached the 1970s, the county commission was running serious deficits, and over the next 15 to 18 years, those deficits rose, and finally in the early part of the 1990s, Escambia General Hospital was finally closed. Now, as we move a little bit beyond that, with the other things that were happening in the county, many of these things were good. For example, in the early part of the 1960s, plans were made for the creation of the University of West Florida. And the county worked diligently at this, the county commissioners did, helping to provide 1,000 acres for the site for the university. And of course, that went into ground by the early part of the by 1967. And that fall, the first class matriculated at UWF. Beyond that, of course, we begin to see the county beginning to spread out. By the time we reached the late 1960s, the very basis of the automobile business began to change because population was moving north. And in 1966, a man named Bob Salter was the first to establish a franchise, his Chevrolet franchise on North Highway 29. And in 1966, we had the beginning of what we even today call Car City. And step by step, one by one, the other automobile dealers moved there. And of course, as this happened, this required additional roads, additional subsidiary travel in that area, and consequently more expense for the county. But of course, that was part of it. As we move into the 1970s, another crisis began to evolve, not just for Pensacola or Escambia County, but for all over the country. By this time, the population of the United States was suddenly becoming aware of problems in pollution. And in 1971, 72, 73, the Congress passed the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts. Both of those, of course, placed great new responsibilities on the county to do things that would help clean up what was already in a very poor condition in some parts of our county, and of course to work with the industries and other parts of the community to overcome water and air pollution. Now, as this happens, beginning in the 1970s, we begin to see a new movement which was going going to be require a great change. And that movement, of course, was with the development of sewage treatment plants. Many of these new subdivisions that were being built all over Escambia County, the developers put in their own primary sewage treatment equipment plants. And these were primary systems. And after a few years, it became obvious that all of these combined were beginning to pollute waters and streams. And consequently, the movement began across the way for Pensacola as a city, or Escambia County as a county, to begin to do something to combine all of these resources into a single source so that the best possible treatment could be given. And so step by step, work began on this. One by one, the county did acquire some of these subdivision treatment plants and put them into a slightly better system. But finally, in the early part of the 1980s, the city and the county combined with legislative assistance and created a new body, which at first was known as the Escambia County Utility Authority, which in turn took charge of all of the water and sewer production, at least in the lower part of the county, and through at least as far as both of those services were concerned, also within the city of Pensacola. So ECUA came on board in 1981. The county divested itself of those holdings it had had in this way, and worked with the ECUA and the city to make a broader, more effective situation. Well, as all this was happening, of course, we were beginning to have more problems with something else called drainage. Every time a subdivision came on stream, it seemed that the runoff of waters coming down roads and across other properties caused new problems. And so for the next 25 years, and even into the 21st century, the county faces the problem of drainage control. And this was, of course, part of another activity that was enforced across the state, that the county then was forced to create what became known as a comprehensive land plan, which meant not just water and sewage, of course, but drainage of all kinds, and then all of the other functions for which the county was responsible. The land plan took several years to develop, and of course the commissioners worked very diligently at it. And as each one of these things progressed, of course, each one of them cost money. And as year by year passed, we began to see with the population growth, this was in part taken care of that way. But year by year by year, the amounts of money that were assessed as property values, and then the collection of taxes just kept going up and up and up. And what had been at the turn of the 20th century, where the county had collected something less than $100,000 a year in taxes. Now this was escalating 2 and 3 times that amount because the needs were there. Okay, as we move also through the 1970s, the county and all of the other basic services in the community, governmental services that is, came together and said, well, it's time for us to consolidate all of these to make these services more accessible to the average taxpayer. And so the plan went forth to create what became known as the Governmental Complex downtown. And of course, this required the purchase of a large segment of property downtown, and this was finally established early in the 1970s, and the construction began with the building of a new county courthouse, which was built, of course, along West Government Street, and that was building number 1. The state followed with a building of its own, and the only one that really fell back was the school board. They decided they did not wish to spend the money to be part of this, and they did not. Okay, the city, of course, did proceed. They built their new city hall in the mid-1960s, and along the way, of course, the courthouse became so active a place that it had to be enlarged, and of course, this was done a little bit later. When we talk about the county buildings, now we're going to jump ahead just a little bit in our story into the early part of the 21st century, because by that time, county government was growing step by step every year in terms of numbers of employees and of additional services being rendered to the public. And so the decision was made that we were going to begin to draw all of the services, all the constitutional offices, all of the basic county services into, if possible, closely into a single unit. And so instead of having various services here, there, and everywhere about the city and the county, a new plan was made to to acquire all of the land within a square block, which was bounded by Government, Palafox, Intendencia, and Balin. And a new plan was put forth. It cost about $22 million to do so, but all of these buildings were improved or actually rebuilt, or new ones established. And about the year 1987 or 2007, the new complex of county government was in place and is functioning there today. Now, we have so many other things that the county has done in recent times. We want to just remember a few of them because they are highlights. For example, the question was, how are we going to pay? How is the public going to pay for a lot of these things? And so there are some acronyms that kind of come on stream with this. The local option sales tax was one, something that was approved by the voters. The second one was a local option gasoline tax, which added additional money for providing roads. Then, of course, the county, of course, was to be part of the economic development program for the area. And along the way, one of the things that they did was, the commission did, was to acquire the old Ellison Field, a Naval Air Aviation Auxiliary Field north of the city, and that became Ellison Industrial Park. And then that was followed by a second industrial park in the area called Marcus Point. And of course, the county has done this, and both of those parks and a third one in progress have been very successful for the community. Now, in addition to that, of course, there have been some other buildings acquired, and there's been all sorts of action desired by people across the county. And this is where the county and the developers and others have run into some problems, because as we proceeded, and these of course have been headlines across the area for many, many months, various environmental elements began to be drawn as an impediment to so-called progress in construction of roads or subdivision. People became very familiar with, of course, with the beach mouse and some of the other animals which would be put at risk if other construction proceeded, and consequently certain things slowed down. There have been some other problems too. The county has, of course, had to worry about storms and damage and all sorts of other things. And by the time we reached the year 2000, the county had 282 buildings which it owned and were insurable. That's a lot of money, of course, and this was something that people just had to take care of, because by now the county itself had insurable. This is all of the people living in the county had roughly $415 million worth of $415 billion worth of properties, and these brought in an annual tax revenue to the county, ad valorem tax, of about $350 million. By the time we move into the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st, we began to run into some other problems too. Some of the investments that the county had were put into, at one point in the 1990s, were put into what seemed to be a very high return investment technique called derivative bonds, and that did not work out too well, unfortunately, and the county lost something like $15 million in it. And then shortly after the beginning of the 21st century, 4 of our commissioners became involved with some land purchases and sales, which turned out to be, well, let's put it this way, not exactly what they should have been. As a result of that, the governor removed 4 commissioners from office and replaced them, and it took a good many months for this political scar to heal over, but happily it has done so. Well, moving into the 21st century, we've had a number of events which were, of course, helped complete the story for the county. Hurricanes were at the peak here. In 2004, the terrible Hurricane Ivan swept across the area, causing millions and millions of dollars worth of damage for citizens, for residences, for buildings, and for the county itself. It cost well over $100 million to repair the damages there. Working with FEMA, and the county had to, of course, employ many different organizations to help clear away brush, dispose of it, and then make plans for improvement and restoration. And then, if that wasn't enough, the following year came Hurricane Dennis, which again was, well, not quite so much a problem as Ivan had been. It nonetheless was serious, and it helped to promote why we had to change and move the sewage treatment plant, which was the kind of the control for ECWA, and move it outside of the city limits to the north, which, as the 21st century has proceeded, that has been in progress, and as we make this episode recording today, that project is almost completed. So county government has gone a long way from Andrew Jackson to the year 2009, but nonetheless it has grown and grown satisfactorily, and I think it's nice to appreciate how much county does for each of us.